Hi, and welcome to On, an experimental collage podcast hosted by GMK in collaboration with Petar Vranjković and our artist-in-residence, Andrea Knezović. In this series of podcasts, we will delve deep into Andrea's work, questioning ideas such as rest, adaptation, and autoethnography. Andrea Knezović is a visual artist and researcher based in Amsterdam. Her artistic practice is based on the semiotics of dialects of value, autoethnography, quite often, identity politics. While her research practice lays on the foundation of politics of care and the institutional implication combined with its mythological aspect, she has contributed to various discursive journals such as MIT, Lish, and Simulacrum. Knezović is currently a resident at the Miroslav Kraljević Gallery through September and October, and in collaboration with her, we've developed this podcast series questioning narratives of care, its implications, and its boundaries. This podcast is also a part of the discursive program for her upcoming exhibition, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. What intrigued me in Andrea's work is this interesting idea of experimenting with ideas of rest and how she questions the narrative of it through a sociopolitical lens, quite often embracing the speculative that comes with it. She is quite often dithering on these ideas and the idea of using speculative fiction as a forensic method to excavate and design research narratives. Now that this type of short introduction is over, first of all, I want to welcome Andrea to the podcast. To start off, I have this simple question. What are your references in your artistic and research practices?
Artistic references. And, well, I would say, first of all, that my practice works as a triangulation of different things. Predominantly, I have my artistic practice, which is a conceptual one, and then there is a research element and also an institutional involvement. So my references and methodologies really depend on also kind of which aspect I'm employing in which moment within my practice. And I also, of course, use a lot of academic frameworks to also fill and also add to my, of course, artistic discourse. But in particular, I think coming also from a little bit from a tradition of conceptualism, I definitely had I have definitely been influenced by Lawrence Weiner, Robert Barry, Mladen Stilinović as well, and Hane Darboven as well. Who else? Let's see. Yeah, these are kind of I would say artists that are heavily conceptual, but as well, I have very much a lot of contemporary references that I'm interested in these days. And in relation to academia, I think recently, because I have been busy with this notion of 24/7 paradigm, I have been very much rereading a wonderful scholar, Jonathan Crary. Tiziana Terranova is one of the also people that I really like. Julia Kristeva, of course. But I think, in a way, my practice is very much an intersection of critical theory, also, let's say, decolonial feminist discourse, and, well, I would say maybe institutional frameworks in general. So whatever that means within artistic and academic discourse. But I think that's it for now. I think that's how I would answer.
So what was your influence to dive even deeper into these ideas of autoethnographics? For example, in your work, Adapting by Transgressing, you've written, "I've survived by adapting. Now I create my own mythologies." How did you even come up with such a strong sentence that makes you question narratives in this way?
Well, psychocultural topologies are in particular fascinating for me. How we negotiate culture within us and how we create our intimate truths and histories. Especially when it comes to mixing memories, desires, and contexts we're in. That intersection often creates space for our own mythologies, actually. But here, by mythologies, I mean reclaiming autonomy over our own narratives, especially in relation to autoethnographic fiction. So, for example, how we can actually imagine future and future prospects of certain history when our ability to claim sovereignty over our cognition is so fragile in the late capitalism, and also how we navigate those economies, those intimate economies. I actually think reproduction of fiction and cognitive capitalism go hand in hand in that sense.
Here at the Miroslav Kraljević Gallery, you're presenting a form of a black cube, fighting this narrative of white cubes and their intent on exhibition politics. Could you maybe expand on the idea of reducing the form of the exhibition space into something that delves deeper into politics of care and research?
Yes, thank you, Petar. I think, first of all, like juxtapositioning white cube, I think black cube is often associated with absence, or kind of, it has this like tradition of absence, but also it's a space that we really don't know any content about. It's a space where that it's mysterious, and oftentimes it just reflects output and input. And for me, that's very fascinating in relation to actually performativity, because black cube is oftentimes associated with performative space as well. And I think my diagrams are very much hold this core-like quality. And they're oftentimes, when you enter space, when they overtake the space, they're asking performers to interact and engage. So they do hold this performative element. So for me, relationship between performative element of my diagrams, a black cube, comes naturally. In relation to care, I think this containment of light or absence of light in that sense also gives us a space of stillness and space for reflection, or in this case, lack of content, where we can actually take care of ourselves. So maybe that is the answer to your question. I don't know.
I think it answers the question quite obviously. So as I'm looking into one of your diagrams here in the space that, as you know, I adore, I noticed this fascinating Venn diagram of someone else's bullshit you have to deal with, your ego, and a pinch of pain. My question is, how did you come up with connecting those three into homogeneous idea, and how do you connect other things in your work?
That's a good question. Yeah, we always want to know how artist does things, right? Well, in this case, like for me, these diagrams are, in a way, their attempt to contain chaos, in particular my own chaos, my cognitive chaos or my emotional chaos, but also the chaos of the outside. So the order actually happens in the viewer's cognition or head when they look at the diagrams. They're the ones that through identification create their own order, connection, or choreographed meaning. I'm just the one that gives them the context and ideas to remove themselves from another setting and to immerse themselves to a new emotional landscape where they can map or negotiate certain anxieties, traumas, or even future possibilities of self. So yeah, for me, my diagrams are very, very much playing with these emotional cognitive negotiations. But they're also, as I mentioned earlier, they're very performative, and they seek to be identified or recognized or performed within someone else's mentality or context. So this is how these things work. They're in a way codependent with the spectator. Yeah, I think the best way to look at them is that they're collective and intimate ruminations of contemporary late capitalism. And I think we all can find ourselves within those dialectics written on those walls or floors or ceilings of the art spaces.
Over the past few weeks, we talked shortly about cultural politics, lack of structural performance, and museums as mausoleums, and how this is actually your first time exhibiting in Croatia. Do you maybe want to shortly expand on those ideas?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think being born in the Southeast Europe and being brought up by a system that doesn't exist anymore, I I think I'm not the only one, but definitely I think that generationally we found ourselves in a very peculiar situation because we were brought up in two different systems. One was called socialism and the other is today's late capitalism. And I think for me, it's interesting to reflect and observe also this different kind of structural performance and institutional performance in Netherlands, which is the country that I reside now, and also Croatia, which is the country that I came from. But I think performativity is a key term here, because I think institutional performativity is definitely connected to cultural and actually psychocultural context. Because, of course, like every topology has a very different operational mentality, and we cannot translate different kind of operational systems onto one another without taking into account the psychocultural context. So the performativity is here the interesting question, actually, because different kind of psychocultural context demands also different kind of institutional performativity. In Netherlands, for example, institutions are very much oriented towards high efficiency, whereas here, institutions operate in a very different way. So for me, I think it's very interesting to look at how actually a particular mentality dictates a certain logic of institutional performance, because we cannot implement Dutch cultural system into Croatia if we don't look at, for example, the mentality of Croatian performance, institutional performance, and vice versa. We cannot implement Croatian cultural tactics into the Dutch system if we don't consider a Dutch rigor towards work ethics, value production, and Calvinist essentialism. So I think one of the things that we should always be mindful of is actually not to necessarily translate the contexts, but rather to actually, not to translate, but to actually complement one another. The other thing that I find very interesting that it's arising now as a question in Western cultural politics is this idea of institutional rest, and can art institutions take a sabbatical? But when I say sabbatical, I mean infrastructural sabbatical, meaning that besides just their staff taking a time off, also that they are taking a time off from producing culture and also rethinking the whole institutional framework. And this is something that maybe in the context of Croatia is still an idea that it's not yet doable because of various other factors. But I think slowly also Croatian context will come to the point where they will need to rethink what is the meaning of their institutional performance and the history and contemporary history that it's being produced. So, yeah.
So I have this maybe quite simple question that I haven't had until up to now, but what is rest to you, and how do you maybe look at it? How does it contextualize what you do and how you do it?
I initially started this whole research because I lack rest and I struggle with rest in general. What is rest for me? Rest for me is when I am not cognitively engaged whatsoever with anything. So maybe conventionally or in a more conservative way, we assume rest as a physical also activity or inactivity. But for me, rest is actually the ability to completely shut down mentally, especially in this day and age where cognitive capitalism is really co-opting our intimacy on so many levels, through technology, through notifications, through attention economy. We constantly need to be engaged with everything. And cognitive capitalism is basically focused on kind of extracting resources, cognitive and creative resources and attention from us, and also monetizing on it further. So for me, resting, I think, well, honestly, I don't really have a extremely illuminating answer. Most of the time, for me, resting is not consuming any content and being, for example, in nature and just switching off, tuning in with myself.
To me, maybe rest is like, this idea of sleeping, as we've talked recently about my sleeping habits and stuff like that, that I sleep for like up to 10 hours a day. So maybe rest to me is quite completely different from your like perspective, especially since to me, rest is something that I physically need. Like I need to sleep for longer periods of times because I was constantly in the state of burning and burnout, which we even briefly talked about. And I'm very interested because I've also mentioned and quoted the American author Tessa Mosgev quite a few times while we were talking the last few days. And in her book, My Year of Rest and Relaxation left quite a huge impact on my life ever since I read it in 2018, 2019. In the book, and I'll try to keep it as short as possible, the idea of grief and burning is quite evident. The protagonist's whole mission is to rest for a full year, to sleep, to mourn, to try to diversify her assets of resting. So I'm thinking of this maybe question that might be redundant, but do you think it makes sense in this day and age to rest, sleep, and try to not burn yourself out with everything that's going around us, from politics to social economies to everything that is quite evident in the art world, but also quite evident in social terms?
I think rest and grief and mourning are very interesting. They have a very interesting relationship. And I think there's something there that I'm also trying to understand and excavate. But I think grief is a particular type of resignation towards engagement with the society. It's withdrawal. It's a form of withdrawal and a form of also self-care and protection, even though it usually and oftentimes comes as sudden affect. I think, with the warfare and all this tragedy happening in the world, and us being in a constant states of anxiety and despair, I think like as a society, we're already in a burnout for a very long time. I also experienced the burnout a few years back, and it's something that shocked me. I was not aware that I was burning out, and then I collapsed. And I think this is also something that we're witnessing now in a society. And for me, an interesting question in relation to geopolitics now is like, how do we rest in the time of warfare? Because also like, there's so many people that are displaced, and rest became a commodity, and rest became an ultimate luxury or a notion that they need to merit for. And I think it's becoming less and less conceptual, this whole paradigm around rest politics, and more real for all of us. Not just in relation to labor politics, but in relation of how we assume space and time and within our autonomous reality, but also as a society, because, like rest is very primordial. It's something that we all need. We cannot exist without it. And yet it became a luxury, it became a commodity, and now it became also kind of like part of the bourgeois conversation, and it almost angers me to see that it's becoming like It's becoming a construct that actually is so unattainable. I think, what grief does today to all of us, I think we're all in a state of grief in a way, one way or another, because it forces us to stop. It really forces us to stop.
We briefly mentioned this form of rest that comes after burning and definitely after a burnout. Is that something that you've maybe dealt with in your practice, and how?
I mean, absolutely. I have experienced the burnout myself, as I mentioned earlier, and one of the things that it's really difficult for an artist is to stop creating, to stop producing, especially if your livelihood is dependent on your practice and also on the market trends and other things, funding. I think it's extremely a big problem, because also it's a problem that is entangled with infrastructure and it also the legal means and like the prospect of legality and ability also to perform adequately within a society, because if the environment that you're in doesn't have specific social welfare that can accommodate if there's some kind of rupture happening, such as burnout in your personal life, if your insurance doesn't cover it, if the system doesn't have grants that can support artists in urgency, or which is also a concept, artist in urgency is also something that it's a very interesting construct. Especially, it was more pronounced during Corona crisis, which we all witnessed as well. I think this is also a topic that it's not just something that I deal with. I think every single creative individual that works from their own practice and funds themselves from their own practice is facing what happens when you get sick, what happens as a freelancer when you have to stop, when you have to take a break, when there's no other option. What do you do? Where do you go? And it's terrifying. I think it's like this level of precarity. I think it paralyzes most of us. I think I see that also in certain countries, also Netherlands is one that is trying to tackle that better, but there are now new legislations and new also like strategies that are trying to kind of accommodate to these needs and also prevent certain individual and also social collapse. But this is still very much at its beginnings. So yeah.
Since we talked about rest, do you believe that it should be a public resource?
When you say public resource, I presume that you're thinking of if it should be considered as something that everybody has a right to, or that everybody can attend rest in a particular setting. Well, this is something that we are also, through our book and initiatives that we're doing in Netherlands, I think this is also something that I'm trying to start a dialogue around, especially with public stakeholders such as municipalities and also legal entities that work for the municipalities. We're trying to suggest to funding bodies to reconsider how grants are written, or the matters, the requirements around the granting system to be changed, so rest can be considered within those scopes, in particular in relation to art funding. In terms of considering rest as a resource in general, I think rest was always a social resource. It was always a cultural and also like an individual resource. But recently, well, not just recently, also as the cultural and also economic and industrial revolutions and technological revolutions progressed, I think rest became more and more co-opted by different types of economy. And now, at this point where we are entering this kind of like third stage where technology is becoming so embedded in our lifestyle, daily lifestyles. I think we're really struggling to differentiate if rest is something that is ours, or is it a product of a certain, certain luxurious mentality, or in this case, economy.
Do you then believe that cultural institutions such as museums, galleries, platforms deserve to rest?
I mean, of course, yes.
As you know, cultural values are radically different from here in Croatia and the Netherlands. And as we've talked about this recently, I also felt that maybe this is also an interesting topic in which we could expand, especially because the Balkan mindset, like that we have in Croatia, is to rest and to live. But do you think that it's possible to have this mindset still in this capitalist playground that we currently live in?
I think we're still very lucky here. I think we are living in a capitalist reality here in Balkans and Mediterranean parts. But I think this resignation to be productive, towards productivity, is wonderful here, because I think Netherlands it's a predominantly Calvinist country, like Protestant Calvinist country. And there's something about that mentality that it's really goal oriented, and also it's very productive, very, very, very modest in terms of rest, and in terms of also leisure and hedonism and excessiveness of laziness, I would say. Whereas I think we are on the other end. I think we're a bit more hedonistic, a bit more self-oriented as well, in a healthy way. But I think we are not so focused on productivity, and I think this is initially the basic difference between these two mentalities. Yeah.
So maybe it was like exit question or an exit term. I'm quite fascinated by this idea of rest and what it holds to you. Could you maybe tell me what would be the perfect and ideal type of rest for you?
I think I'm still trying to figure that out as well. Well, maybe on a personal note, like, I personally suffer from anxiety. And for me, the notion of rest is not just related to labor, but it's also related to my nervous system being at peace and being calm. And I think I'm not the only one that often experiences anxiety in contemporary living. And I think this is also something that it's more and more recurring. And I think also mental health issues these days are becoming more and more pronounced in the younger generation. And I think trying to be busy with producing value and being radically productive is what would eventually bring me to, let's say, at least personally, to a better methodology of rest. I don't have an answer of what is the most ideal way of resting, but I'm trying to figure that out by attempting these questions each time, and also by witnessing other people and their ways of dealing with rest or lack of rest. But I think, in a way, it's also about seeking that place of home to rest. And maybe that's something also that I'm trying to negotiate within myself. Where do I feel at home? Where do I feel at peace? And where can I rest, actually?
Everything that has been said here today and for the past 2 days has been very exciting and very uplifting in a weird way, especially when we think about rest and these implications that it has. And I first of all want to thank you for hosting this podcast with me and trying to make this discursive element of the exhibition quite more interesting than what has been done before in the space. I also want to thank you for exhibiting here and trying to kind of change this introspective galleries and how they should behave towards the public. I also want to thank our sponsors, the Ministry of Culture and Media of the Republic of Croatia, the City of Zagreb, the Office for Culture, and the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but I also want to thank the Kultura Nova Foundation and Ina for giving us continuous support over the years. We would also like to thank Hugo Barringer and Miroslav Matanovic for technical support, because without them, the podcast wouldn't have been able to be produced. We would like to thank you for listening to On, a podcast about trust, relaxation, and everything in between.